Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all of you, especially those of you tuning in, our new friends at Daystar Television. Today's commentary is about how things are not what they appear to be on the Canadian political scene and in our culture. It's called The New Liberalism: Why Canadians Suffer Under Uniparty Tyranny. Liberalism has become a religion of self hatred. It teaches white people to hate their race, boys to hate their sex, women to hate their femininity, Westerners to hate their countries and their history. What a loathsome, poisonous thing it is these days. But, it was not always this way. Liberalism used to be a really good thing. So we must ask the question, well, what happened? I have a law professor friend who describes himself as a classical liberal, and he's a really nice guy. He's wickedly smart. So, are you a classical liberal like him? How could you know without first understanding what liberalism is? What does that word, so commonly thrown around by just about everyone these days, actually mean? Well, it seems strange now, but liberalism was once heavily associated with nationalism. To be a nationalist was to be fundamentally liberal, as this meant that you saw the nation or the people as the true font of political legitimacy. And this meant that the whole nation should have a say in the state. Such egalitarianism also meant that elite allegiances, transnational or cross ethnic, had to be subdued or else totally erased. The most obvious case was the feudal monarchy, epitomized by the Habsburg dynasty. They ruled territories composed of French, Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, and Slavic subjects spread throughout Central and Eastern Europe. The other transnational force, also a major supporter of monarchy, was the Catholic Church in Western Europe, and to a somewhat lesser extent, the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, this led to rampant anti-clericalism, where secularism became a bludgeon against traditional powers and privileges of the Catholic Church. The 1789 Declaration of Rights in Man in France provided for religious freedom and was as much an idealistic statement of personal freedom as it was a tool to strike at one of the most powerful anti-national forces in all of France. Subordinating the Catholic Church to the French civil government was attempted, but ultimately the revolutionaries sought wholesale liquidation of the Catholic Church. And they even backslid on the ideal of religious freedom with establishment of the state-backed cult of reason. In Eastern Europe, this led to establishment of new national churches like the Church of Greece. The jurisdiction of a specific church came to be more heavily tied to a specific people and the borders of their state. The legacy of this shift is felt even in the 21st century, with dissolution of transnational bonds and establishment of the nation or people as the supreme authority. Liberty was not an emancipatory force, but rather a constraining one. It existed to restrain powers claiming authority superseding that of the people. These would be manifested, especially in Western Europe, as rights and freedoms. Freedom of religion, speech, and assembly were championed by European liberals as tools to constrain the monarchy and the church by giving preferential power to citizens. Even today, in the remaining monarchies of Europe, the sovereigns have fewer rights than their subjects do. For a subject may publicly complain about the crown's ministers, but the crown most often cannot do so. Well, by the mid 20th century, nationalism and liberalism had diverged. While a nationalist could also be a liberal, the two concepts were no longer conflated. And this was partly due to the ultimate success of democratic liberalism in Europe. By the dawn of the Great War, most remaining European dynasties had transformed themselves into popular monarchies who couched their power and authority as stemming from the nation or the people. The newly established Kingdom of Italy and the German Empire were the poster children for this transformation. These states amalgamated dozens of formerly independent ones driven together, headed by a single monarch. But to achieve preeminence as head of state, such monarchs had to submit to a constitution, which fundamentally limited their power. So popular monarchy was a public contract between the sovereign and the people. The monarchy could only exist if the people or the nation consented to it. A victim of its own success, liberalism would soon begin to lose control of national feelings as monarchs used them to bolster what remained of their own power and authority. And so nationalism came to be separated from liberalism, culminating in the rise of fascism and socialist patriotism in the early 20th century. The ultimate defeat of fascism, and particularly Nazi German atrocities, forever stained the reputation of nationalism in the minds of liberals. However, it would be the international nature of the Cold War which would shift liberalism into an international school of thought. Due to chronic fears of communist subversion and geopolitical concepts such as the domino theory, liberals came to view all democracies as bound to a broad anti-communist international order. Liberty, once a means of constraint against the throne and altar, came to be seen as a marker of brotherhood and an end in itself. Liberty was then universal, and liberalism fully international. And this is what we now call classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is the idea that individual freedom and limited government are the best way for humans to form a free society. The question arises because the facts behind the term classical liberal are usually a revelation. This is a vital consideration, given the political realignment in the West around the world, with many on the left moving to the right, becoming classically liberal or just liberal in the truest sense of the word. Now, all of this might sound a bit confusing, and that confusion is primarily caused by the usual leftist Orwellian distortions of reality with word meanings, where without rational justification, they have laid claim to every positive sounding political term. They seek to cover for the fact that their collectivist ideologies are grounded in falsehoods and force. It is thus important to consider the question and the facts behind classical liberalism. The phrase can be traced from the fact that the good men who founded countries like Canada and the United States were considered liberals, but their ideological beliefs were antithetical to leftists who sought to exploit them as their own. Anti-liberty leftists have cynically co-opted the term to hide authoritarian intentions. The phrase classical liberal therefore defaults to liberal. The phrase classical liberal was coined to somehow differentiate between the two, even though the phrase is hardly ever defined in dictionaries, and classical liberal usually defaults to just liberal. The problem for them is that the facts behind the word's original meaning still exist. Even worse for them, most dictionaries go full Orwell in modifying the meaning to bring it in line with the far left dogma that perverts the very notion of what is meant by the term classical liberal. And so classical liberalism is the idea that individual freedom and limited government are the best ways for humans to form a free and prosperous society. Its tradition begins with great thinkers like John Locke and Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Jefferson. While they tinkered in their own ways with the ideas of classical liberalism, the core belief that the individual should always be considered before the group remained a constant. Thomas Jefferson even added the pursuit of happiness to his Declaration of Independence to emphasize that our happiness was not the state's to give, but ours to take. Putting the individual above the group not only empowers us to live our lives as we see fit, it also neutralizes the forces of racism and bigotry, which judge people not on their merits, but through immutable group traits such as skin color, gender, religion, or sexuality. Now, these days, liberalism has been confused with leftism or progressivism, which actually has nothing at all to do with classical liberalism. Sadly, the left is no longer liberal at all. It has traded individualism for collectivism, placing us in an oppression Olympics where victimhood is virtue and strength is immoral. Now, does the idea that individual freedom and limited government is the best way for humans to form a free society sound leftist or right wing? Which side of the political spectrum is based upon the pillars of individualism and personal liberty? Which side is mired in collectivism and fake collective rights? Does individual freedom and limited government not sound a lot like what we now call conservatism? Well, consider that both ideologies are based upon individualism, while the leftists are mired in collectivism. This makes it important to note that the left is no longer liberal. In other words, collective or group rights are non existent, since rights can only be bestowed upon individuals. Dr. Nigel Ashford explains the core principles of the classical liberal and libertarian view of society, as well as the proper role of government. Firstly, liberty as the primary political value. Secondly, individualism. Third, skepticism about power. Fourth, rule of law. Fifth, civil society. Six, spontaneous order. Seven, free markets. Eight, tolerance. Nine, peace. And finally, number 10, limited government. His second principle is individualism, meaning that the individual has primary importance over the collective. We must not sacrifice the welfare of individuals for what some argue is the common good. COVID-19 lockdowns in 15-minute cities are modern examples. This was the central ethos of communism and fascism, that individuals simply do not matter. Ashford's other 9 principles all describe the pro-freedom right rather than the authoritarian left. We can also see that the left has conjured a false distinction. It still attempts to exploit the liberal label as cover while rejecting its core tenets. Many leftists openly equate classical liberalism with conservatism for obvious reasons. And so it has finally happened. Liberal ideas have jumped ship and landed on the right side of the political spectrum. The left and right are now loaded terms, lacking universal definition, and which change along the timeline of history. In the 21st century West, the political left is tagged liberal, while the political right is dubbed conservative. Both sides still wave their respective flags, but the dichotomy has flipped. Conservative is the new liberal. Labels are, of course, useless in helping us to understand ideas, policies, or people. Terms like left or right, conservative or liberal, Nazis or Marxists, and racism have been weaponized with such inaccuracy, such generality, and such repetition as to render them all meaningless. However, the shifting sands of politics and society in the West do require some touchstones. Concern for protection of civil liberties and suspicion of government intrusion and overreach once defined the left. In the 1960s age of Aquarius thinking, free speech and watching out for the man were prerequisites to liberal credentials. Big government was the enemy, especially the intelligence branch and the war machine. Looking out for the working class was vital. Make love, not war, was the theme of most every Bob Dylan song. Free speech and civil rights were hallowed causes. Credentials for liberalism could only be issued by the political left. Corporations, wealth, and power were considered the stock in trade of the right. Conservative fat cats loved big business, big banks, and big military. Intel agency spying and war were considered the acceptable cost of doing business. But today, the left controls Silicon Valley, the land of the tech giants. Banks and corporations push leftist DEI and ESG programs. The military went full on rainbow in countries like the US, Canada, and Great Britain, and the left spun up a war in the Ukraine and did likewise in the Middle East. The left loves intel and censorship, hates Christianity, and never met a war not worth funding with taxpayer money. Take a listen to some of President John F. Kennedy's most famous speeches. He was a liberal Democrat in his time, but his speeches would never be able to be heard anywhere near the Democrat Party today. If you heard them from a conservative MAGA politician at CPAC, they would receive thunderous applause. JFK's nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., even disavowed the Democrat Party to take on a prominent position in the Republican Trump administration. So, liberalism is not dead. It has simply moved into the right side of politics. A well spoken example of this is Dr. Brett Weinstein, a former college professor and lifelong liberal who found himself run off campus when he stood up for free speech principles. Although still a self professed staunch liberal on the left side of the political spectrum, he considers the current Democrat Party to be dangerously totalitarian for advocating war, discrimination, and censorship. Weinstein likens the Democrat Party to a rabid family pet gone mad and must now be put down. Weinstein is not alone. Many liberals have found themselves alone in the no man's land of independent thought. The liberal coat they once wore has been stolen by leftists who discarded classical liberalism somewhere along the way, but kept the liberal cloak and had it sewn into a straitjacket. The rage, hate, and intolerance being spewed by the left at the right in places like Minnesota is all that remains. The Democrats are now the party of rage, of hate, and of intolerance. They even claim the right to march into Sunday morning church services led by disgraced former CNN anchor Don Lemon. Well, to be fair, we can find hate-filled rants on the right as well. Just stream a few minutes of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, or Matt Walsh, for example. But listen carefully to what each side is objecting to and what they are advocating. Only one side demands uniformity, silence, and obedience by using the full force of the state. Only one side defends free speech, free thought, free markets, and the free exchange of ideas. Tolerance and decency have a new address. Live and let live has moved to a new part of town. There is simply no denying that conservative is now the new liberal. That appears to be the case in the US, but is this equally true of Canada, where liberal dominance deepens across institutions and effective opposition has grown more cautious than assertive? Such imbalance raises the specter of a de facto one-party state. Pierre Poilievre just won his leadership review with an 87.4% support rating of CPC members. He delivered a primetime address to thousands of his party's loyal supporters in Calgary before delegates cast their ballots. He opened his remarks with a tribute to his Alberta roots before touching upon the promise of Canada that he referenced during last year's federal election campaign, which saw him lose his seat in Parliament. Poilievre said that a decade of liberal rule has dashed the hopes for Canadians across the country, but he promised to work with Prime Minister Mark Carney to resolve the trade war declared by President Trump. Clearly, his party wants more of the same leadership it has suffered under since Poilievre took over. But why? Well, there is an unspoken rule in politics. Criticism is encouraged when aimed outward, but treated as betrayal when directed at your own side after a loss. The moment this happens, analysis is treated as treason. Any suggestion that your side's strategy might be flawed is met with questions of loyalty rather than discussion, as if the party were a fragile life raft rather than a mighty battleship meant to win power. And such reflex is understandable, but it's also revealing. When a movement becomes more committed to managing disappointment than demanding victory, losing stops being a problem and becomes the normal state of things. After every CPC defeat in recent years, the same ritual unfolds. The loss itself is quickly acknowledged, then immediately softened. Attention shifts away from the election outcome toward secondary metrics meant to dull the blow. Quote, a record share of the youth vote, a strong showing compared to last time. At least the Liberals did not get a majority. These are the catchphrases we hear, and they're offered not as analysis, but as consolation. We saw this play out prior to Christmas last year, when the CPC showed no interest in defeating the Liberal budget. Doing so could have brought the Carney government down and forced a national election. But the CPC chose not to do so. The response from party faithful was immediate. Quote, this was a chess move. They need to give Carney the opportunity to fail. They stopped something worse from happening. Each comment attempted to reframe inaction as strategy. None of them addressed the underlying critique. None of them asked whether this mindset has ever actually produced lasting and effective political power. This is what coping looks like in politics. The insistence upon recasting failure until it feels like progress. The goal quietly shifts from winning to not doing as badly as expected. Over time, that shift becomes normalized. Losing becomes tolerable, then familiar, then defensible. You become what the Washington Generals were to the Harlem Globetrotters, a foil, someone to play the game with, but the result is never in doubt. Elections are not performance reviews like the one that just reaffirmed Pierre Poilievre's party leadership. They're not graded on a curve. They are closer to Game 7 of a championship series. You either win or you lose. No one cares who had better possession time or who exceeded preseason expectations. They only recall who lifted the trophy. And politics are no different. Power cares not about effort, intention, or narrative spin. It responds only to victory. Imagine a football coach at the Super Bowl explaining that his plan is to hope that the other team fumbles the ball. That is not strategy. It is resignation pretending to be preparation. Yet this is precisely how CPC losses are explained publicly. The party's role is framed as waiting patiently for liberal incompetence and corruption to become so unbearable that voters must hand over the reins to the only other option. The problem is that this strategy has a long track record of mostly failure. When winning depends upon your opponent collapsing, rather than your own inspiring vision driving people forward, then defeat is ever just one elbows up slogan away. Coping narratives may soothe supporters after a loss, but they do nothing to change the conditions producing serial electoral defeats. Playing not to lose is still losing. The clearest example of this came with the CPC apparently wanting to ensure that the recent Carney deficit bill was passed. The loyalist justification was that forcing an election before Christmas risked gifting the Liberals a majority government. That outcome was treated as the ultimate failure to be avoided at all costs. Whether or not that assessment was correct in the moment is almost beside the point. What matters more is the logic behind it. The CPC does not play to win. It plays to avoid the worst case scenario. In doing so, it abandons allegiance to any concept of liberalism, conservatism, or indeed to truth itself. A party which behaves in this way lacks any identity that voters can distinguish and support. The CPC logic is now colliding with reality. Multiple CPC MPs have since crossed the aisle, leaving the leftist carny liberals one seat away from a majority government. The very outcome, which the CPC strategy was designed to prevent, is now perilously close to materializing without an election, without a fight, and without the CPC forcing any meaningful confrontation. It is a classic case of self-fulfilling prophecy. Caution did not buy security, it merely delayed the reckoning while weakening the party's leverage. Risk aversion has quietly become the CPC's guiding principle. Every move is filtered through the same question: how do we minimize damage? Not how do we take ground, not how do we force a reckoning, not how do we stand up for conservative principles. The net result is a politics of permanent caution, where boldness is treated as recklessness and confrontation is self-inflicted harm. Over time, this instinct becomes strategy. Now, this is often defended as maturity or prudence, but in practice, it's more about cowardice and self-preservation. A party that expects to lose learns to manage loss carefully. It avoids risks that might end political careers, even when those risks are the only plausible path to victory. It avoids fights based upon principle in favor of pragmatic politics. Losing narrowly feels safer than risking everything and failing spectacularly. But safe losses still leave them out of power. And now, increasingly, without even the ability to block the leftist carny liberals from causing the worst possible outcomes for Canadians. Now, the worst part of playing not to lose is that it concedes ground in advance. It accepts that the liberals set the terms and that the CPC merely respond. But power is not granted to the party that offends the fewest people. Fortune favors the bold, and so power is taken by the party that defines the conflict. When your strategy is built upon avoiding attacks rather than launching them, you are already fighting upon your opponent's terms. As Sun Tzu put it in his The Art of War, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. We must make him believe we are near. End quote. And so the darkest truth about this is that, unlike the United States, Canada is no longer a two-party system. One reason why this pattern keeps repeating is that Canadians misunderstand our own political history. Now, we like to think that we live in a competitive two-party system where power swings back and forth based upon performance, just like in America. But that is just not how Canada actually works. Historically, Canadian federal politics are defined by long governing liberal dynasties punctuated by short, unstable conservative interludes. Nor is this at all a controversial claim. It is a well-documented one. Dynasties and interludes, past and present in Canadian electoral politics, is a detailed account of every federal election in Canadian history. Lawrence Leduc and John H. Pamet show how liberal dominance is the rule rather than the exception. From 1896 to 1911, then again 1935 to 57, then from 63 to 84, then from 1993 to 2006. Long stretches of liberal rule broken only briefly by conservative governments arriving at moments of crisis and then leaving once stability is restored. This pattern is striking because it is so very consistent. Liberals govern until they overreach, mismanage, and fracture. A crisis ensues. Conservatives are ushered in not as visionaries, but as caretakers. They are tasked with restoring order, stabilizing finances, or cleaning up scandals to restore voter confidence in the system. And once the emergency passes, voters return the Liberals to power, often with renewed legitimacy. Case in point, 2015, Justin Trudeau's Sunny Ways majority. The Harper interlude ended, and the dynasty resumed. And this helps explain why conservative strategy so often revolves around waiting for liberal exhaustion, waiting for the next economic collapse, waiting for public outrage to boil over. The party does not position itself as an alternative governing philosophy so much as a temporary corrective, a political aspirin to treat voter headache. It does not actually cure the underlying malady. Its role is reactive by nature, by design. And when politics are this dysfunctional, playing not to lose makes sense. I mean, if your historical role is to manage crises rather than define the future, then caution just feels right. But that same caution also ensures that conservative governments remain brief and fragile. They enter power without a mandate for transformation and leave without having reshaped the political landscape. And this is why there is no lasting legacy from the Harper years. No judges, no senators, no monuments, and no enduring legislation to check the advance of leftist progressivism. The net result is a cycle that reaffirms itself. Liberal dominance breeds conservative timidity. Conservative timidity reinforces liberal dominance. Breaking that cycle requires more than patience or better timing. It begs for a party willing to reject the role history has assigned it, to govern as if it intends to stay. To do that, it must act with purpose and in accordance with clearly defined conservative or classically liberal principles. Not one like the CPC that would see a lesbian LGBTQ lobbyist like Melissa Lantsman become our next deputy prime minister. Only a party corrupted by the political left would do that. So, why do the Conservatives perpetually fail to win federal elections in Canada? It's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it for you. Well, there's a simple explanation for why this pattern occurs. Conservatives fail to offer a compelling countervision of the country and its future. They offer opposition, they offer critique and restraint, but rarely present a clear picture of what Canada should become. And that vacuum shapes everything else. A party without a future story cannot lead, it can only react to what the Liberals are doing. As we have seen, part of this explanation is philosophical and ideological. Conservatism, by its very nature, is oriented toward conservation and preservation. It seeks to protect cherished institutions, traditions, and norms from rapid decay and leftist onslaught and destruction. And this is quite proper. In stable societies like Canada once was, it is a necessary force. However, preservation alone is insufficient when the institutions being preserved are already hollowed out or captured by the left, as the Liberals have done. At this point, conserving the status quo is indistinguishable from managing decline. The CPC, whatever it once was, looks just like the Liberals. It thus has no appetite or agency to preserve classically liberal or conservative values such as individual liberty, protection of private property, or protection from big government overreach. The CPC wants the same power that the Liberals have. They just promise to exercise it more wisely than the Liberals are now under Mark Carney. Instead of articulating a positive vision, the CPC defaults to negation. They say, "We are not the Liberals. We will be more responsible. We will not go as far," they say. These are not visions. They are relative positions, entirely dependent upon the failures of the governing Carney Liberals. And when your identity is defined by contrast rather than by conviction, then success depends upon your opponent's internal collapse. And without a counter vision to excite and unite Canadians, the CPC struggles to explain why they should hold power beyond a temporary fix. They promise competency in a system that increasingly feels incompetent and corrupt by design. And when the Liberals inevitably regain their footing, as they have done post Justin Trudeau, that limited mandate just vanishes. A party which cannot articulate a better future will always govern on borrowed time. Conservatives must therefore call out the CPC for what they are. The response to pieces like this usually sounds something like, if you are critical of conservatives, then you are just helping the liberals. And this is where it is important to note that we are not conservatives in the tribal sense. We were not drawn into politics by party loyalty or by ideology. We were pulled in because leftist politics started to encroach upon everyday life, on work, on speech, on property, on our families, on universities, on Jews, on Christians, on the church, on mobility, and on basic civil trust. This is not about left versus right. It is about power centralization versus decentralization. Any system that allows one party to dominate indefinitely will rot, regardless of whether it shrouds itself in labels like constitutional democracy. The Liberal Party of Canada, which must be clearly distinguished from any concept of classical liberalism, has accumulated an unprecedented degree of institutional, cultural, economic, social, and bureaucratic power. Corruption thrives in such conditions, not because individuals are uniquely immoral, but because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that is why CPC complacency matters. Because when the only viable opposition to the liberals refuses to act like it intends to govern decisively, it becomes complicit in the imbalance. Criticism, in that context, is not disloyalty. No. Rather, it is the bare minimum required to prevent our current stagnation from becoming permanent. Shared opposition to liberal corruption does not automatically produce a coherent alternative. It only creates a temporary alliance of convenience. Without a clear strategic vision for dismantling captured institutions like the CBC and restoring accountability, even well-meaning conservatives become caretakers of a broken system of governance. And this is also the reason for the urgency with which I write this. Canada is not in a normal political cycle. We are approaching a threshold beyond which reform will be impossible. This is not the moment for incremental positioning or long-term brand management. It is the political equivalent of being down on points with a minute left in the last round of a prize fight. We do not win by protecting ourselves. We win by taking risks, by going for the knockout, by swinging from our shoelaces. Calling this out is as uncomfortable as it is necessary. Silence is easier, but it does not alter outcomes. And at this critical juncture, only outcomes matter. Quote, the fascists of the future will call themselves anti-fascists. That's from Winston Churchill. And from Ronald Reagan, who said, if fascism ever comes to America, it will come in the name of liberalism.
Hungry for truth beyond the television? Well, extend the conversation with Grey Matter online. Grey Matter's insights continue in your inbox. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter where we dive deeper into the spiritual battles facing Canadian families today. Equip yourself to stand firm in your faith and lead with godly wisdom. Join our growing community of truth seekers at substack.com/Grey Matter newsletter. Subscribe today and never miss the Canadian perspective on what matters most. Was Jesus a political activist or the victim of history's greatest legal sham? In Leighton's new booklet, Character on Trial, The Real Jesus, Leighton applies a litigator's lens to the evidence of his life and trial. Get your free physical copy for this Easter season by emailing us at greymatterconnect@gmail.com. Don't just take the world's word for it, examine the evidence for yourself. The battle has always been over people and ideas, but they're just the targets. The real enemies are spiritual principalities and powers. Grey Matter's purpose is to reach out with the voice of Christian truth to men between 18 and 44. We believe that these sons and fathers are Christ's inheritance. Join us financially and help us to speak so Canadians hear truth that sets men free and brings families to Jesus. Contact us by email at greymatterconnect@gmail.com or mail us at Post Office Box 2436, Fort Macleod, Alberta, postal code T0L0Z0. Thank you for your support.